Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
One word changed everything. What would you do if the person you loved most looked into your eyes and quietly whispered, "Leave"? Would you pack your bags, slam the door, and never look back? Or would you stay one more night, hoping something invisible could still be saved? My story begins on an ordinary evening in the United States, but before the sun came up the next morning, my marriage, my confidence, and even the way I learned English had changed forever. If you have ever felt tired, lonely, misunderstood, or ready to give up on love, or even on learning English, this story may feel like it was waiting just for you. The sentence was only one word long. Leave.
No shouting.
No broken plates. No dramatic movie scene. Just one quiet word from my husband that somehow sounded louder than any scream I had ever heard. For a few seconds, the whole house felt strangely silent. Even the old refrigerator stopped humming, or maybe my heart was beating too loudly to hear anything else. I looked at him, expecting him to smile and say he was joking. He did not. His face looked tired, not angry, not cruel, just exhausted. That frightened me even more. People often survive anger. Silence is much harder to survive. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but my mouth refused to move. Instead, I stood there holding a warm coffee mug that suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. Funny how life works. A cup of coffee weighs almost nothing until your world begins to fall apart. We had been living in a quiet American neighborhood where every lawn looked perfect, every mailbox stood straight, and every family smiled politely while walking their dogs. From the outside, our life looked almost picture perfect. We had 2 wonderful children, steady jobs, weekend grocery trips, backyard barbecues during the summer, and holiday decorations that made our house glow every December. If someone had driven past our home, they probably would have said, "What a happy family." I used to believe the same thing. But houses can hide stories that windows never reveal. Looking back now, I realize our problems did not begin that evening. They had been growing quietly for months, maybe even years. Stress has a strange habit. It never knocks on your front door. It slips through tiny cracks until one day it is sitting at your dinner table. My husband worked long hours. I tried to balance work, parenting, cooking, cleaning, and improving my English because I believed speaking better English would help me build a better future in America. Every evening I practiced simple sentences while washing dishes. Today was a good day. Tomorrow will be better. I can do this. Those little English phrases were never just language practice. They became tiny promises I whispered to myself whenever life felt too heavy. Scientists who study stress often explain that our brains react to emotional rejection almost like physical pain. Brain scans have shown that feeling unwanted activates some of the same regions that respond when we are injured. Maybe that explains why one simple word hurt more than I thought possible. It was not only my heart that ached. My whole body felt weak, as if every dream I had carefully built in America had suddenly lost its foundation. Still, something inside me refused to move toward the front door. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps deep down I believed that difficult conversations deserve one more chance before good people give up. That night I walked upstairs, sat beside the bedroom window, and watched the streetlights reflect on the quiet road outside. Everything looked peaceful, yet inside me a storm had already begun. I had no idea that choosing to stay in that chair instead of leaving the house would completely change the future of my marriage, my family, and even the way I viewed love itself. Sometimes the biggest turning point in life is not a grand decision. Sometimes it is simply deciding not to take the next step. And believe me, the reason I stayed had nothing to do with weakness. It was something far more surprising than that. Our happy beginning. If you had met us a few years before that heartbreaking night, you would probably have smiled and said, "They're going to grow old together." Honestly, I would have believed you. Our story did not begin with tears. It began with laughter, awkward conversations, and the kind of hope that makes ordinary places feel magical. We met at a neighborhood community event shortly after I moved to the United States. I was still adjusting to American life, still surprised that complete strangers smiled and asked, "How are you?" even while walking past each other. At first, I thought everyone genuinely wanted a long conversation. Later, I learned that sometimes a simple, "I'm good, thanks," was enough. It became one of the first little English expressions that made me feel less like a visitor and more like someone who belonged. My husband laughed when I told him about my confusion. Instead of making fun of my mistakes, he smiled and said, "You're learning faster than you think." Those words stayed with me much longer than he probably realized. Looking back, encouragement can become the strongest memory in a relationship. And cozy coffee shops where every cup somehow tasted better because we were dreaming about our future. We talked about buying a home, raising children, planting flowers in the backyard, and building a peaceful life that felt safe after years of uncertainty. Neither of us cared about expensive things. Our greatest luxury was believing tomorrow would always be a little brighter than today. We eventually bought a modest house in a quiet suburb where children rode bicycles until sunset and neighbors waved while mowing their lawns. Every season brought something new to love. Spring covered the streets with colorful flowers. Summer filled parks with family picnics and backyard barbecues. Autumn painted every tree in shades of orange and red that looked almost unreal. Winter arrived with snow that made our children run outside before breakfast, wearing boots that were always too big. Those simple moments became the pages of the happiest chapter of my life. We built routines that felt comforting. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, coffee, and cartoons with the kids. Sunday afternoons meant grocery shopping together, arguing playfully about which cereal to buy, and ending the day with homemade dinner. Some evenings we practiced English together. I would slowly read children's books aloud because simple stories helped me improve my pronunciation without feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes I stumbled over easy words and everyone laughed, including me. Instead of embarrassment, those moments created warmth. Research in educational psychology suggests that people learn languages more effectively when they feel emotionally safe because lower stress allows the brain to absorb and remember new information more easily. I did not know the science back then, but I experienced the truth of it every day. Love made learning easier. Confidence made speaking possible. My husband often reminded me, "Don't worry about perfect English. People remember kindness much longer than grammar." That sentence became one of my favorite life lessons. It was never really about language. It was about courage. Of course, no marriage is perfect, even during its happiest days. We disagreed about money sometimes. I preferred saving for the future, while he believed memories were worth spending on. He loved spontaneous road trips. I loved detailed plans. He could fix almost anything around the house. I could barely assemble a bookshelf without reading every instruction twice. We joked that together we made one fully functional adult. Those little differences made our relationship interesting rather than difficult. At least, that was what we believed. What neither of us understood was how quickly small misunderstandings could grow when life became busier. Responsibilities multiplied quietly. Careers demanded more hours. The children needed more attention. Bills arrived more often than vacations. The conversations that once lasted for hours slowly became 5-minute updates before bedtime. We promised ourselves things would calm down after next month, then after the holidays, then after one more busy season. Somehow, that peaceful season never came. Looking back now, I realize relationships rarely fall apart because of one terrible day. They slowly become hungry for attention while both people are too busy believing they will feed them tomorrow. The strange part is that neither of us noticed how much had changed until the night everything almost disappeared. And the biggest surprise was that the warning signs had been sitting quietly in front of us all along, hidden inside the ordinary days we believed would last forever. Silent distance. Have you ever noticed that relationships rarely break because of one terrible moment? They usually change so slowly that you hardly recognize the difference until one ordinary evening suddenly feels unfamiliar. Looking back now, I can honestly say that our marriage did not collapse overnight. It faded one quiet day at a time, almost like autumn leaves changing color so gradually that you never notice until the entire tree looks different. That was exactly what happened to us after several busy years of building our life in the United States. We were still living under the same roof, eating at the same table, driving the same roads, and raising the same wonderful children. Yet somehow we had stopped truly seeing each other. Every morning began before sunrise. My husband rushed to work with a travel mug full of coffee, while I prepared breakfast, packed lunches, answered emails, and reminded the children not to forget their backpacks. The house was always full of movement, yet strangely empty of conversation. We still asked practical questions like, "Did you pay the electricity bill?" or "Who is picking up the kids?" But we almost never asked the questions that actually mattered. How are you feeling? Are you happy? Is something bothering you? Those simple questions quietly disappeared from our home without either of us realizing it. Life in America can be wonderfully exciting, but it can also move incredibly fast. Everyone seems busy chasing deadlines, paying mortgages, planning schedules, and trying to build a better future. Somewhere in that race, we accidentally treated our marriage like another item on a never-ending to-do list. Psychologists often describe this as emotional drift, a gradual process in which couples lose their sense of connection not because they stop loving each other, but because daily responsibilities slowly replace meaningful attention. That explanation made perfect sense when I finally learned about it years later. At the time, however, all I knew was that something invisible had quietly entered our home. Even our evenings changed. We used to laugh together while cooking dinner. Now one of us cooked while the other answered work emails. The television filled the silence because silence had become uncomfortable. Sometimes we sat on the same couch for an entire hour without exchanging more than a few sentences. It was almost funny in a sad way. Two people connected to high-speed internet, but disconnected from each other. Meanwhile, I continued practicing my English every evening because I refused to give up on my dream of feeling completely at home in America. I listened to slow English stories while folding laundry, repeated simple expressions during walks around the neighborhood, and whispered short sentences while washing dishes. Everything will be okay. Keep going. One step at a time. Those phrases were helping my English improve, but without realizing it, they were also becoming little reminders to protect my own heart. Research from relationship experts has consistently shown that couples who regularly express appreciation and maintain small daily conversations often report stronger emotional bonds than couples who rely only on grand romantic gestures. The science surprised me because it sounded so ordinary. Apparently, healthy marriages are not built on dramatic moments. They are built on thousands of tiny interactions that quietly tell another person, "I still see you." Unfortunately, we had stopped sending those messages. The children noticed before we did. They never said anything directly, But children are experts at reading emotional weather. They can feel tension even when adults believe they are hiding it. Our son once asked why Dad smiled more at work than he did at home. That innocent question stayed in my mind for weeks. I wanted to tell him everything was fine, but the truth caught in my throat because I was no longer certain it was. Then came the misunderstandings. Small comments suddenly sounded like criticism. Forgotten chores became proof that someone did not care. A delayed text message somehow felt personal. We were no longer listening to understand. We were listening to defend ourselves. Looking back, I realized neither of us was trying to hurt the other. We were simply exhausted, and exhausted people often mistake silence for peace when it is actually distance. The strange part was that our neighbors still smiled at us. Our family photos still looked beautiful. And our social media posts still showed happy vacations and birthday celebrations. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. Inside our home, however, tiny cracks were spreading across the foundation, one conversation at a time. I often wondered whether love had quietly disappeared or whether it was simply buried underneath stress, responsibility, and years of unspoken feelings. I did not know the answer then. But I was about to discover it in the most unexpected way imaginable, because one ordinary evening, after another exhausting day that looked exactly like every other day, my husband would say a single word that would force both of us to confront everything we had been avoiding for far too long. The night he said, "Leave." Some memories never become old. They stay frozen in your mind with every tiny detail perfectly preserved, almost as if your brain secretly refuses to let them disappear. I can still remember the soft rain tapping against the kitchen window, the smell of tomato soup slowly cooling on the stove, the sound of our daughter laughing upstairs, and the clock on the wall quietly counting seconds that would soon divide my life into two completely different chapters. Until that evening, I believed difficult days always ended with an apology, a hug, or at least a promise that tomorrow would be better. I had no idea that one ordinary Tuesday night would become the moment I would replay in my mind hundreds of times. Searching for the exact second everything changed. My husband came home much later than usual. His shoulders looked heavy, and his face carried the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone cannot fix. I smiled anyway, because I believed kindness could soften a difficult day. "Dinner is almost ready," I said gently. He nodded without looking at me. It was such a small moment that most people would never notice it, but relationships are often shaped by tiny moments rather than dramatic scenes. We sat at the dinner table with our children, pretending everything was normal. Our son talked excitedly about a science project. Our daughter proudly showed a drawing she had made at school. I laughed with them, but inside I felt an invisible wall growing between my husband and me. He answered every question with one or two words before staring quietly at his plate. Even the children sensed something unusual and slowly stopped talking. The silence became another guest sitting at our table. After the kids went upstairs to finish their homework, I quietly carried the dishes into the kitchen. I hoped we could finally talk honestly. Instead, we stood only a few feet apart, separated by emotions neither of us knew how to express. "Is everything okay?" I asked. It sounded like such a simple question. He took a deep breath but did not answer immediately. Instead, he rubbed his forehead and looked out the window into the dark American neighborhood where porch lights glowed peacefully, making every house appear calm and happy. Then he finally spoke. "I'm tired." At first, I thought he meant work. I understood that feeling. We were both tired. Everyone raising children, paying bills, and building a future understands exhaustion. But then he continued, "I'm tired of everything." My heart immediately began beating faster. Psychologists explain that during emotionally threatening conversations, the brain often activates its survival response before logic has time to catch up. Heart rate increases. Breathing changes. The body prepares to fight, run away, or freeze. I did not know the science then, but I remember every physical sensation. My hands became cold. My stomach tightened. Even holding a glass of water suddenly felt impossible. I asked quietly, "What do you mean?" He remained silent for several long seconds that felt like entire minutes. Finally, he looked directly into my eyes. There was no anger there. That was somehow the most painful part. There was only sadness, mixed with complete emotional exhaustion. Then he spoke the word I will never forget. Leave. Just one word.
Calm.
Quiet. Almost gentle. Yet it landed with the force of a hurricane. Everything inside me stopped. My first thought was not about divorce. It was about our children sleeping upstairs. It was about Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, family road trips, bedtime stories, and every ordinary memory that suddenly felt as fragile as glass. I wanted to shout. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to ask how we had reached this moment without either of us realizing we were getting lost. Instead, I stood completely still because sometimes the deepest pain leaves no room for words. My husband looked away almost immediately, as if he regretted saying it the very second it left his mouth. But words are strange. Once spoken, they never return unchanged. They continue living inside the person who hears them. I slowly walked into the living room and sat beside the window. Outside, nothing had changed. Cars still passed quietly. A neighbor walked their dog. Rain continued falling gently across the street. The entire world looked perfectly normal while mine had quietly fallen apart. I thought about packing a suitcase. I even imagined opening the front door and disappearing into the cold night. My pride whispered that leaving would protect my dignity. My fear whispered that staying would only bring more pain. But then another voice, much quieter than both, asked one unexpected question. What if this isn't the end of your story? That single question stopped me from standing up. Scientists studying long-term relationships often explain that during moments of extreme emotional conflict, people frequently make permanent decisions based on temporary emotional states. The healthiest couples are not those who never experience breaking points. They are often the ones who pause long enough for emotions to settle before deciding the future. I did not know whether our marriage could survive. I did not even know whether he truly wanted me gone. But something deep inside refused to believe that years of love, sacrifice, shared dreams, and raising two beautiful children together could honestly end with only one exhausted word. So instead of reaching for my suitcase, I reached for patience. I had absolutely no idea that the decision to stay silent for one more night would become the most important decision I had ever made. Because before the sun rose the next morning, I would discover a truth about my husband that changed everything I thought I understood about love, pain, and the real meaning of never giving up. Choosing calm over pride. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, but the strange part was that I had barely slept at all. My eyes were open for most of the night, watching tiny shadows move across the ceiling while my mind replayed that single word again and again. Leave. It echoed so many times that it almost lost its meaning, yet somehow it hurt even more every time I remembered it. I quietly walked downstairs, expecting to find an empty kitchen. Instead, my husband was already sitting alone at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked older than he had the day before. Not because of gray hair or wrinkles, but because sadness has a way of changing a person's face overnight. Neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Surprisingly, That silence felt different from the silence of the previous evening. It no longer felt angry. It felt frightened. Finally, he whispered something I never expected to hear. I didn't sleep either. Those 4 simple words cracked open the wall that had separated us for months. I realized something important at that moment. I was not the only one who had been suffering. We had simply been suffering in different languages. I expressed my pain with tears and quiet disappointment. He buried his beneath long work hours, forced smiles, and emotional distance. Psychologists often explain that many people, especially those under constant stress, struggle to describe vulnerable emotions. Instead of saying, "I'm overwhelmed," they become silent. Instead of saying, "I'm afraid I'm failing," they become distant. Instead of saying, "Please help me," they accidentally push away the people they love the most. That morning, I finally understood that his painful word had not come from hatred. It had come from exhaustion. I slowly sat across from him without saying anything. For the first time in months, neither of us rushed to defend ourselves. Research on conflict resolution consistently shows that when emotional intensity decreases, the human brain regains access to logical thinking and empathy. In simple words, people make better decisions after they stop fighting with their emotions. Looking back now, I am incredibly grateful that neither of us packed a suitcase that night. Pride wanted me to leave immediately, because pride always promises quick relief. Patience quietly asked me to wait until the storm inside both of us became calm enough to see clearly. The difference changed our entire future. After several long minutes, my husband looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I don't think I want you to leave. I think I wanted all this pressure to disappear." That sentence completely changed the meaning of everything I had heard the night before. Suddenly, I was no longer standing across from an uncaring husband. I was sitting beside a man who had quietly carried too much responsibility for too long without ever admitting he was breaking inside. Of course, that realization did not magically solve our marriage. Broken trust never heals in a single conversation. But it gave us something we had been missing for months: understanding. I decided that morning to make one small promise to myself. Before reacting to painful words, I would always try to understand the emotion hiding underneath them. That lesson helped not only my marriage, but also every other relationship in my life. Interestingly, it even improved my English. While practicing slow English every evening, I noticed that language is not only about vocabulary. Real communication is about emotion, timing, facial expressions, and listening carefully before answering. I began reading simple English stories aloud again, repeating gentle sentences like, "Let's talk." "I understand." "Take your time." Those phrases seemed ordinary, but they slowly changed the atmosphere inside our home. Studies in neuroscience suggest that calm, respectful conversations reduce stress hormones while increasing feelings of emotional safety. In other words, the way we speak can literally influence how another person's brain responds. That idea fascinated me because I had always believed words were just sounds. Now I understood they could also become medicine or poison, depending on how we use them. Over the following days, we agreed to stop pretending everything was fine. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations until they exploded, we scheduled quiet evening walks after dinner while the children rode their bicycles nearby. Sometimes we talked for only 10 minutes. Sometimes we spent an entire hour sharing fears we had hidden for years. There were tears. There were uncomfortable silences. There were moments when we almost gave up again. But every honest conversation removed one small brick from the invisible wall we had built between us. Looking back, I realized the strongest marriages are not the ones without conflict. They are the ones where two imperfect people decide that understanding matters more than winning. My husband had once told me to leave. Now, without saying it directly, he was asking me to stay. And although neither of us realized it yet, the smallest daily conversations that followed would soon create the biggest transformation our family had ever experienced, proving that sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that last forever. Small conversations, big healing. People often imagine that saving a marriage requires one unforgettable speech, one grand romantic surprise, or one dramatic promise that changes everything overnight. I used to believe that too, but I was completely wrong. Looking back now, I realize our family was not saved by one extraordinary moment. It was saved by hundreds of ordinary conversations that almost seemed too small to matter. The funny thing about healing is that it rarely announces itself. It quietly arrives disguised as simple habits. A shared breakfast. A gentle question. A sincere apology. A smile that lasts 1 second longer than yesterday. Those tiny moments became the invisible bridge leading us back to each other. The first change happened during breakfast a few days after that painful night. Usually, my husband rushed out the door with his coffee before anyone had finished eating. That morning, however, he stayed. He helped our son pour cereal. He laughed when our daughter accidentally spilled orange juice across the table. It was not a perfect morning. We were still carrying emotional scars. But for the first time in months, our children looked relaxed instead of cautious. Children notice hope much faster than adults. Research in developmental psychology suggests that children living in emotionally supportive homes often feel safer, become more confident, and communicate more openly because they constantly observe how adults solve problems. Watching our children smile reminded me that healing a marriage was never only about two adults. It was about protecting the emotional home our children would remember for the rest of their lives. We started creating one simple family rule. Every evening after dinner, nobody touched a phone for 30 minutes. At first, it felt surprisingly uncomfortable. We had become so used to scrolling through news, checking emails, or watching television that actual conversation felt strangely unfamiliar. My husband joked that talking without distractions was harder than assembling furniture without instructions. We all laughed, but deep down we knew he was right. During those 30 minutes, we asked simple questions. What made you smile today? What was difficult? What are you thankful for? At first, the answers were short. Then they slowly became stories. Our daughter described a new friend at school. Our son proudly explained a science experiment. I shared funny mistakes I made while practicing English. My husband admitted when work had been stressful instead of pretending everything was under control. Those conversations slowly transformed our evenings from routines into connections. Interestingly, I noticed another unexpected change. My English improved much faster because I was speaking naturally every single day instead of memorizing vocabulary lists alone. I learned expressions like, "How was your day?" "I'm proud of you." "Let's figure it out together." They were simple sentences, but they carried genuine emotion. Language experts often explain that people remember vocabulary more effectively when it is connected to meaningful experiences rather than isolated. Repetition. That explained why I never forgot the phrases we used around our dinner table. They became part of real life instead of classroom exercises. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning the garage together, my husband suddenly stopped organizing old boxes and quietly said, "Thank you for staying." It was the first time either of us directly mentioned the night he had told me to leave. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. I almost didn't. He nodded slowly. Neither of us needed to explain the rest. Sometimes forgiveness begins with two honest sentences instead of 200. Scientists studying long-term relationships have discovered that successful couples are not those who avoid mistakes. Instead, they consistently make small attempts to reconnect after disagreements. Relationship experts sometimes call these moments repair attempts. A smile after an argument, a gentle joke, a hand reaching across the table, a quiet apology. These small actions may appear insignificant, but they often predict stronger marriages more accurately than expensive vacations or romantic gifts. The science fascinated me because it perfectly described what was happening inside our home. We were rebuilding trust one ordinary moment at a time. Even our neighborhood seemed different now. Evening walks became part of our routine again. We greeted neighbors, watched children ride bicycles, admired colorful sunsets, and occasionally stopped for ice cream at a small local shop that had somehow become our family's unofficial celebration place. Life itself had not become easier. Bills still arrived. Work remained stressful. Parenting still brought unexpected challenges. The difference was that we had finally stopped carrying those burdens alone. We had become teammates again, instead of silent roommates. Looking back now, I realize that love rarely disappears all at once. More often, it simply waits patiently beneath disappointment, stress, and misunderstanding until two people become brave enough to start talking again. Every conversation became another brick strengthening the foundation we thought had already collapsed. And just when I believed our greatest lesson had already arrived, an unexpected conversation with one of our children would reveal a truth so simple and so powerful that it would completely change the way I understood both family and love forever. What science says about conflict. The biggest lesson about our marriage did not come from a therapist, a best-selling book, or a dramatic life event. Surprisingly, it came from one innocent question asked by our 8-year-old daughter on a quiet Sunday afternoon. We were sitting together in the backyard after lunch while she colored pictures at the patio table. My husband was fixing a broken flower pot, and I was practicing slow English by reading a short story aloud. Suddenly, she looked up at both of us and smiled. "You laugh more now." That was it. Just 4 simple words. Yet they landed deeper than any long conversation we had ever shared. Children have an extraordinary ability to notice emotional changes that adults often overlook. They may not understand relationship psychology, but they understand the feeling of a peaceful home. Her words made me stop reading immediately. I looked at my husband, and for the first time in months, we smiled at each other without forcing it. It felt natural, genuine, almost unfamiliar because we had forgotten how effortless happiness could feel. That afternoon made me curious. I began reading more about relationships, emotional health, and why some couples recover after painful conflicts while others slowly drift apart forever. What I discovered completely changed the way I viewed that terrible night when my husband told me to leave. Researchers studying healthy marriages have found that conflict itself is not usually the greatest danger. Every couple argues. Every family experiences stressful seasons. The real difference lies in how people repair emotional connection afterward. Couples who respond with curiosity instead of constant criticism often rebuild trust more successfully over time. In other words, asking, "What are you feeling?" is usually far more powerful than asking, "Who's right?" That simple idea sounded almost too easy, but it explained everything we had experienced. We had spent months trying to prove our own frustration instead of trying to understand each other's pain. Another fascinating discovery involved the human brain. Neuroscientists explain that during intense emotional conflict, the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, can temporarily take control. When that happens, logical thinking becomes much more difficult. People interrupt more. They misunderstand harmless comments. They remember old arguments instead of solving the current one. It is almost as if the brain switches from conversation mode into survival mode. Suddenly, my husband's exhausted word, leave, made more sense than ever before. It had probably never been a carefully planned decision. It was the desperate voice of a stressed mind trying to escape overwhelming pressure. Understanding that truth did not erase the pain, but it replaced blame with compassion. Around the same time, I noticed another interesting connection between emotional healing and learning English. Before our relationship improved, I often practiced English while feeling anxious or discouraged. I memorized vocabulary, but many words disappeared quickly because my mind was constantly distracted by stress. After our home became calmer, something unexpected happened. New expressions stayed in my memory much longer. I enjoyed reading aloud again. I smiled while listening to slow English conversations. Educational psychologists have long suggested that positive emotional environments improve learning because the brain becomes more open to storing new information when it feels safe instead of threatened. Looking back, I realized I had experienced that principle without even knowing its scientific name. Healing my heart quietly helped my English grow stronger too. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, my husband suddenly laughed after I mispronounced the word comfortable for what felt like the 100th time. Years earlier, I might have felt embarrassed. Instead, I laughed with him and tried again. Comfortable. Still wrong. We both laughed even harder. Finally, he smiled and said, "Your accent tells our family's story. Never be ashamed of it." I still remember those words because they changed more than my confidence in speaking English. They reminded me that perfection had never been the goal. Growth was. Relationships work the same way. Perfect couples do not exist. Growing couples do. Research repeatedly shows that gratitude is another powerful predictor of lasting relationships. People who regularly notice small acts of kindness often experience stronger emotional satisfaction than those who constantly search for perfection. Inspired by that idea, our family started a simple evening tradition. Before bedtime, each person shared one thing they appreciated about someone else that day. Sometimes the answers were funny. Thanks for making pancakes. Sometimes they were deeply emotional. Thanks for listening to me. Those tiny moments slowly reshaped the emotional atmosphere inside our home. Appreciation became louder than criticism. Hope became stronger than fear. Looking back now, I no longer believe that our marriage survived because we were exceptionally strong. It survived because we became willing to learn. We learned how stress changes behavior. We learned how listening creates safety. We learned that patience often speaks louder than anger. Most importantly, we discovered that love is not measured by the number of perfect days two people share. It is measured by how many imperfect days they refuse to face alone. And although our family had already come farther than I ever imagined possible, one final realization was still waiting for us, a realization that would completely redefine what love, home, and forever truly meant. A new view of love. I used to believe that love was something you found once and then simply kept forever. It sounded beautiful, almost like the ending of every romantic movie I had watched growing up. But after everything my husband and I had survived together, I finally understood that love is not something you store safely on a shelf. It is something you choose again and again, especially on the days when choosing feels difficult. That realization did not arrive during a special anniversary dinner or an expensive vacation. It came quietly one chilly autumn afternoon while we were walking through a neighborhood park in the United States, watching golden leaves drift slowly onto the sidewalk. Families were laughing, children were chasing squirrels, and an elderly couple walked ahead of us holding hands. They moved slowly, taking tiny steps together. I smiled as I watched them disappear around a corner. My husband noticed where I was looking and gently squeezed my hand without saying a word. That small gesture somehow said everything we had struggled to express during the hardest year of our marriage. It reminded me that love often speaks most clearly through actions too small for photographs but too meaningful to forget. Living in America had also changed the way I viewed family. When I first arrived, I imagined happiness depended on achieving big goals, a better job, a larger house, perfect English, financial security, and a future where every problem had already been solved. Gradually, I realized that many happy families around us were not living perfect lives at all. They still faced unexpected bills, stressful jobs, health concerns, and disagreements. The difference was not the absence of problems. It was the presence of teamwork. That lesson quietly transformed my own expectations. Around that time, I continued practicing English every evening, but my motivation had changed completely. Before, I wanted perfect pronunciation because I worried about making mistakes. Now, I wanted communication. I wanted to understand people more deeply. I wanted my children to see that learning never ends, no matter your age. During family dinners, we sometimes played a simple game where everyone shared one new English word they had learned that week. Our daughter proudly announced words like kindness and adventure. Our son loved words related to science. My husband occasionally chose funny expressions he heard at work. We laughed at each other's pronunciation, corrected one another gently, and celebrated every improvement. Language had quietly become another way of bringing our family closer together instead of another source of pressure. Educational researchers often explain that families who learn together frequently strengthen both communication and emotional connection because shared learning encourages curiosity rather than competition. Looking back, I could see that happening inside our own home. Even ordinary conversations became opportunities to grow. One evening, while sitting on our front porch after the children had gone to bed, my husband looked up at the stars and quietly said something I will never forget. I thought asking you to leave would solve my problems. Instead, it showed me that I was running away from myself. I remained silent for a long moment because I knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes people think changing their surroundings will erase their pain, only to discover that unspoken fears quietly travel with them wherever they go. Psychologists describe this as emotional avoidance. Problems hidden beneath the surface rarely disappear on their own. They simply wait patiently until we become brave enough to face them. We had finally stopped running. We had chosen honesty over comfort, patience over pride, and understanding over assumptions. That decision slowly reshaped every part of our relationship. I also noticed something unexpected about myself. I no longer felt afraid of difficult conversations. In fact, I welcomed them because I understood that silence had nearly cost us everything. Whenever tension appeared, I gently reminded myself of a simple English sentence that had become my personal motto: let's talk before we decide. Those 5 words became one of the greatest lessons of my life. They reminded me that emotions are temporary, but decisions can last forever. Scientific studies on emotional resilience consistently suggest that people who openly discuss challenges instead of suppressing them often recover. Healing is rarely instant, but it is absolutely possible. As autumn slowly turned into winter, our home felt warmer than it had in years. Not because anything outside had changed, but because the atmosphere inside our hearts had finally changed. Laughter returned naturally. Family dinners lasted longer. Weekend road trips became adventures instead of obligations. Even quiet evenings felt comforting instead of awkward. Looking back now, I no longer saw the night my husband said, "Leave," as the end of our story. Surprisingly, It had become the painful beginning of something wiser, deeper. And just when I believed our greatest chapter had already been written, one final moment would reveal the true reason I never walked out that front door, a reason that would stay with our family for the rest of our lives. The home we saved together. The moment I finally understood that our marriage had truly changed did not happen during a romantic dinner, an anniversary celebration, or even after one of our long conversations. It happened on an ordinary Saturday morning while I stood quietly in the kitchen making pancakes. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house. Sunlight slipped gently through the windows. And somewhere upstairs I heard our children laughing so loudly that one of them almost fell out of bed. A year earlier, mornings inside this house had felt tense, predictable, and emotionally heavy. Everyone moved carefully, almost afraid of saying the wrong thing. Now the laughter sounded effortless. It echoed through every room like music we had almost forgotten existed. I suddenly realized that peace does not usually arrive with fireworks. It arrives so quietly that one day you simply notice your heart has stopped preparing for another argument. My husband walked into the kitchen wearing an old sweatshirt covered with paint from a weekend home project. He smiled, wrapped his arms around me from behind, and whispered, "Good morning." Such ordinary words. Yet months before, I would have given anything just to hear that gentle voice again. Funny how life changes our definition of happiness. At one time, I believed happiness meant reaching big goals. Now I understood that sometimes happiness is simply hearing someone greet you with kindness before breakfast. After we ate together, our family decided to drive to a nearby lake, one of our favorite places outside the city. The children raced ahead carrying pieces of bread for the ducks while my husband and I walked slowly behind them. The air was cool, leaves danced across the walking path, and the lake reflected the clear blue autumn sky like a mirror. Watching our children laugh together reminded me of something relationship researchers often explain. Children rarely remember how expensive their toys were, but they almost always remember how peaceful or stressful home felt while they were growing up. That thought stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. We had not only saved our marriage, we had protected the emotional memories our children would carry into adulthood. That realization meant more than any anniversary gift ever could. During our walk, my husband suddenly stopped beside a wooden bench overlooking the water. He looked unusually serious. For a moment, I wondered whether another difficult conversation was about to begin. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "I found this while cleaning my office," he said quietly. It was one of my old English practice pages from years earlier. Across the top, in slightly shaky handwriting, I had written a simple sentence: "Never give up, even when today is hard." I stared at those words for several seconds before smiling. I had completely forgotten writing them. My husband handed the paper back to me and gently said, "You were teaching both of us, and you didn't even know it." I laughed softly because he was probably right. Every evening, while practicing slow English through simple stories and short conversations, I had unknowingly been training something even more important than pronunciation. I had been training hope. Educational psychologists often explain that repeating positive language influences not only memory, but also emotional resilience. The words we repeat every day quietly shape the stories we believe about ourselves. Looking back, I realized that those simple English sentences had become daily reminders that difficult seasons are temporary. Keep going, one step at a time. Tomorrow is another chance. They were never just language exercises. They became emotional anchors during the hardest chapter of my life. As winter approached, our family created several new traditions. Friday evenings became movie nights with homemade popcorn. Sunday mornings were reserved for long walks through the neighborhood, even if the weather was cold. Before bedtime, we continued sharing one thing we appreciated about another family member. Sometimes the answers were humorous. Sometimes they brought tears. Our son once smiled at his father and said, "Thanks for coming to my soccer game, even though you were tired." My husband quietly looked down before answering, "There is nowhere else I would rather be." In that single moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with years earlier. Not because he had become perfect, but because he had become present again. Psychological research consistently shows that emotional presence is one of the strongest predictors of healthy long-term relationships. People rarely need perfect solutions. They need to know they are not facing life's difficulties alone. That simple truth completely transformed our family. Even our neighbors noticed the difference. She had no idea how deeply those words touched me. Houses cannot actually feel emotions, of course, but the people living inside them certainly can. The walls were exactly the same. The furniture had not changed. The address was identical. Yet somehow, everything felt different because we had changed. Looking back now, I no longer measured success by promotions, savings accounts, or perfectly organized calendars. I measured it by peaceful breakfasts, honest conversations, family laughter, and the quiet confidence that whatever challenge came next, we would face it together instead of alone. And although our story was finally approaching its ending, there was still one question left unanswered. The same question that had quietly followed us from the very beginning. Why didn't I leave? The answer was far deeper than love alone, and it would become the most important lesson I had ever learned. Why I didn't leave. If someone asked me today, "Why didn't you leave that night?" they would probably expect one simple answer. Maybe they would think I stayed because I was afraid. Maybe they would assume I stayed because of the children, because of financial security, or because I did not know where else to go. Those reasons might make sense from the outside, but none of them tells the whole truth. The real answer is much quieter than people expect. I didn't stay because everything was fine. I stayed because, deep inside, I could still recognize the difference between a man who had stopped loving me and a man who had simply become lost. Those are not the same thing. One person walks away because love has disappeared. The other pushes people away because pain has become too heavy to carry. That night, my husband did not know how to ask for help. His heart was exhausted, his mind was overwhelmed, and his emotions came out in the worst possible way. His single word, "leave," almost destroyed everything we had built together. But if I had answered that word with another painful decision, two exhausted people would have made permanent choices during a temporary emotional storm. Looking back now, I realize that waiting until morning was one of the bravest decisions I have ever made. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage quietly sits in the next room, wipes away tears, and decides to have one more conversation instead of walking away forever. That choice changed not only our marriage, but also the future of our children. Years have now passed since that unforgettable evening, and our home feels completely different. The children are older. They still laugh around the dinner table. Weekend breakfasts remain one of our favorite family traditions. My husband still teases me whenever I practice difficult English words, and I still laugh when I accidentally pronounce something incorrectly. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I smile because every mistake reminds me how far I have come. Learning English and rebuilding our marriage followed the same surprising pattern. Progress was slow. Some days felt frustrating. Some conversations ended awkwardly. Some lessons had to be repeated many times before they finally became part of our lives. But little by little, everything improved. Researchers studying long-term resilience often explain that meaningful growth usually happens through consistent small actions rather than dramatic, life-changing moments. Looking back over our journey, I could not agree more. One calm conversation, one sincere apology, one shared meal, one evening walk, one English sentence practiced with confidence. None of those moments seemed extraordinary by themselves. Together, they transformed our family's future. Sometimes I still unfold the old English practice paper my husband found beside the lake. The sentence written across the top has become more meaningful with every passing year. Never give up, even when today is hard. It reminds me that hope is rarely something we suddenly discover. Hope is something we quietly practice until it becomes part of who we are. If you are listening to this story today while carrying your own disappointment, whether it is a difficult relationship, loneliness, fear, or the challenge of learning English, I want you to remember something that completely changed my life. Difficult days do not always tell the truth about your future. A painful conversation is not always the final chapter. One mistake does not erase years of love. One bad day does not define an entire family. Most importantly, one person's temporary frustration does not always reveal their permanent feelings. Give yourself permission to pause before making decisions you cannot easily undo. Listen carefully. Speak gently. Ask one more question. Offer one more chance when it is safe and healthy to do so. Sometimes healing begins exactly where pride tells us to stop trying. Living in the United States taught me many practical things about language, culture, and daily life. But the greatest lesson had nothing to do with English. It was about people. Every family carries invisible battles behind closed doors. Every smile may hide silent worries. Every strong person has moments when they quietly wonder whether they can continue. Compassion becomes much easier when we remember that truth. Today, whenever I finish practicing English, I no longer ask myself whether my pronunciation is perfect. Instead, I ask whether I communicated with kindness, honesty, and courage. Those qualities matter far more than perfect grammar. They also happen to build stronger relationships. So, why didn't I leave? Because love was still there, buried beneath stress, exhaustion, misunderstanding, and silence, waiting for two imperfect people to uncover it together. Staying was never the easier choice. It was simply the wiser one. And every time our family gathers around the table, every time laughter fills our home, every time my husband reaches for my hand during an evening walk, I quietly thank that frightened version of myself who decided to wait until morning. She could never have imagined how beautiful tomorrow would become. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.